Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones, and we're back after a 2-week long hiatus, and we are ready to get back to it. And also, I should say today I'm somewhat pressed for time as I record, so I'll just cut to the chase. If you want to learn more about our church, please visit our website at www.indyncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org, and there you'll be able to learn more about our church and our worship times and of our values. This podcast is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. The Northwood Podcast is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. And you can find out more about the podcast that they produce in addition to ours at www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's www.wishtv.com/podcasts. And there you'll be able to discover what other offerings that they have, podcasts produced here in Indiana by Hoosiers. Finally, if you like what you hear or would otherwise like to offer comment, suggestions, or feedback, please like, subscribe, or follow this podcast with whatever app that you use to listen. I'm told that this will help the algorithm steer more traffic our way. Plus, we would also like to know what you're thinking about. So if you would like to leave a comment below this video or to write into the podcast by way of whatever app that you use, or share it with a friend. Or if you want to write into me directly, you can reach me at my email, which is Heath, that's my name, Heath, at indyncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. But moving on. Here in a moment, we'll be considering a story from the Bible found in Matthew chapter 14. But first, we must pause for some ads for our podcast audience. So we'll see some of you after this break. And we're back. And as I was saying, today we'll be considering a story told in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. That's Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. And it goes. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "But we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This story, the one that you just read, is told in all 4 of the Gospels, which makes it the only miracle story that's told in all 4. In fact, there are very few stories that are told in all 4 of the Gospels, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes just 1. But there are only a few portions of the Gospels that are contained in all of them. These include Jesus' setting out on his ministry, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, his crucifixion, and depending on how you read the Gospel of Mark, his resurrection. Aside from those moments, though, this story is one of the very few that is found in all 4 of the Gospels. Why do I bring this up? Well, to emphasize this point, that back in the early days of the church, a Christian community might count itself fortunate to have just one written copy of just one of the Gospels of Jesus. So you could conceive of a world where you had one of those Gospels and were not aware of some of the stories or miracles or healings that were told in other Gospels in other churches down the road. But it did not matter if your community had Mark's or John's Gospel or Luke's or today's Gospel, which is Matthew. Either way, your community would have read about the story of the feeding of the 5,000, the one you just heard. And now here we are, thousands of years after the fact. It's as if the Holy Spirit knew that future generations of Christians in nearly every place and time would need to be reminded of the abundance that usually surrounds us. It's as if the Holy Spirit could see that in the future, Christians would stress about scarcity in nearly every age, and sometimes they have good reason to, but now, in the age of electric lights, air-conditioned living spaces, and for many of us, more food than we can usually eat, I'm not sure that many of us could complain from just that same place that the people would complain to Jesus from. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we proceed, I should first note how this story of hope and abundance finds us in the wake of tragedy and heartbreak. You may have noticed that this story begins with a then Jesus. Then Jesus gets into a boat. It sort of starts like midstream because Jesus had just learned before the story that his cousin and friend John the Baptist had been killed, executed by the local governing official Herod Antipas. Not only was John the Baptist a powerful prophet, a truth teller with a flamethrower mouth, but he was also, as I said, Jesus' friend and cousin. I only bring this up to note that perhaps we too, you and I, are approaching this story with heavy burdens to bear, broken hearts and anxious minds. I just call your attention to that to remind you that here's a story that breaks through the heartache to teach us that God is still on the move. But still, in the wake of tragedy, as I said, Jesus' friend is dead. So Jesus is grieving as you or I would. And then Jesus tries to take the space and time that he needs to process his grief. The text reads that he withdrew from the crowd and into a boat to sail to some other place to be alone. But somehow the word got out, and pretty soon people from all over are following him. This is a pretty common trope in the stories about Jesus. Because for Jesus, grief or no grief, the world just kept on turning, and there still is work to be done. Well, eventually, the numbers of the people, the work, followed Jesus across the country, until they turned into a bona fide crowd, thousands of people. So Jesus then decides to table his grief, puts to shore, because as the text reads, he had compassion on them being the crowd. Next, he proceeds to do what Jesus does. He heals them, one person after another. And this goes on and on, hour by hour. And as the day drew to a close, it occurred to the disciples that the time had come to call it quits. Very reasonable. Apparently, the crowd found Jesus in the middle of nowhere here, which is unfortunate timing and circumstance, far removed from the markets where people might go to buy some food. So the disciples' solution is to send them home. Very sensible, but also to what end? For this problem of scarcity, that is their empty bellies, they would have just followed the people into whatever place they went to find food. After all, isn't part of the problem in the first place that the people are oppressed and often without what they need to survive? This is the reason we find thousands of people chasing Jesus down in the wilderness in the first place, because there isn't much left for them back in the towns and cities where they live. So maybe that's why Jesus doesn't want to send them home so quickly. But it's like this today. Whenever the poor or the homeless are pushed out of one location, perhaps a public park or to some other public space, and then off into somewhere else, send them home. Well, where's home if they don't have a home? The homeless poor. And we know that when tent cities and park benches are cleared of the unsightly poor, that they'll just move on to some other place. The problems of poverty go with them. They follow the people out to the wilderness and then back to their homes. But it won't matter to you so much if they are out of sight or out of mind. I'm not sure that the disciples were feeling any of these things as they suggested to Jesus that the crowd had better get moving. Could be that the problems that they raised were truly about practical solutions and the logistics of the whole thing. But if they're like me, and I think I know the human heart, I at least think I know my own heart in my own worst moments. And if they're like me, maybe the disciples are wanting to dismiss the crowd so as to wash their hands of the problem. And if that's true, I understand. Problems, there are so many of them. These problems that rise out of injustice. And they're usually easier to contemplate when they are out of sight and out of mind, theoretical, as it were. And heck, if we're fortunate, we'll forget those problems entirely. But Jesus will not let the disciples forget these problems, these people who are right in front of them. Here again, Jesus' response in verse 16. Jesus said to his disciples, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." This verse has long caught my attention. Jesus turns to his disciples after they've presented him with an impossible problem. Thousands of people who are hungry is an impossible problem in that context when there are only 12 of you, plus Jesus. And instead of Jesus saying the expected things, he says something else. I'd expect him to say, "Why, sure, I don't know why I didn't think of that, sending them away. People got to eat. Maybe send them off with some recommendations as to where they should go. Perhaps some of your favorite places to procure food." That's what I'd expect a reasonable person to say. And, I like that advice because it leaves me with the opportunity of helping someone with advice without putting any of the real effort in. Like my own resources, my own, substantial time. How many times have we done this? Someone stops by your house or you meet them in some other place, and after listening to their problem, perhaps you're pleased to be able to refer them to an outreach program or to a helpline to call or to a food pantry or a shelter to stay in. And thank God for those things. Often, this is the very best we can do, sometimes the very best I can do. But here, that's not what Jesus tells his disciples to do. He suspects they can do more, and I suspect oftentimes I can do more. Jesus says to his friends, "You feed them." This is madness. Except what Jesus knows and what the disciples are about to find out is that sometimes you have more in-house than you may realize. And that is a running trope in the scriptures. This idea that sometimes you have more than you know, even whilst running on apparent fumes. It's that old story about the shaving cream bottle that never seems to run out month by month, and then for feels like years, you use the same bottle. It's like the Energizer Bunny, keeps going and going. Or once, I drove for miles and miles in my car with the gas tank needle hovering over empty, and I thought for sure that I'd be stranded, but I made it. I did run out of gas on the way up to the pump, rolling up to the pump, in fact, but I made it. And I learned that sometimes we have all that we need, but just need to find out how far it'll stretch. Now, those are silly examples about the shaving cream and the empty tank of gas, but sometimes things are far more serious. Sometimes people need a lot more help. In fact, the disciples need to look no further than directly in front of them to see this, because there stands these thousands of people in need. And these people, from what we know of their context and the time in which they lived, had serious needs. And I'm sure their needs ran the gambit. But just right now, what most of them need, what they most need, is a bite to eat. 5,000 strong, the text reads, not counting women and children. Typical to not count the women and children, but I digress. Either way, the disciples are presented with an impossible situation, as I said before, not unlike others they'd heard about in the stories in their very own Bibles. And biblical commentators have noticed how today's story about the feeding of the 5,000, how it echoes and has resonance with other stories that we find in the Hebrew Bible that the disciples would have read and on into the Christian scriptures that we have today. Stories that Jesus' disciples would have been well aware of, many of them. And one that comes most readily to my mind is found in 2 Kings chapter 4, an old story. And there we read of a widow who has become poor, so poor after the death of her husband that a creditor has come to collect her children as payment. Her children will be made into slaves unless the creditor is paid off. So the woman, being desperate, cries out to the prophet Elisha for help. After the woman has told Elisha about her plight and her inability to pay back her debts, Elisha asks, "What do you have in the house?" Some versions of the feeding of the 5,000 record Jesus saying similar things to the disciples or a similar thing. And basically, their answer is both Elisha's answer and Jesus' answer: bring me what you've got, and we'll discover together if it's enough. Well, as for the widow in Kings chapter 2, all she had was a jar of oil. And the prophet says, bring it, and bring many other jars besides. In fact, borrow any and all empty containers you can find. Ask your neighbors if you need to, because you are about to have more oil than you can now contain. That's my paraphrase. And she does this. And the story goes that she and her sons filled up jar after jar after jar with oil. I remember when this story was told to me as a little kid. It's part of our Bible stories. I just remember picturing these two little kids with their mom filling up jar after jar after jar after jar. So much oil that she was able to pay off her debts. And her sons lived off the proceeds from the rest. As I said, the disciples would have had this story floating around in their heads. They would have known this story and others like it. So I think that we're beginning to see a running motif here in the scriptures that carries on into the ministry of Jesus, a running pattern. God's people find themselves stuck, believing that they do not have enough. And look at the evidence, it seems to be true. Sometimes they are stuck in the wilderness, just like this crowd before Jesus in today's story. Or sometimes they are stuck like the widow in 2 Kings. The ways that we can be stuck run the gambit. Perhaps most often, we are stuck in a mindset that keeps us from moving forward or from even lifting a finger to repair what is broken in our lives or in the world. Call that apathy, despondency. But Jesus says through it all, get moving. You feed them. So the disciples mill about and find 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And you already know where this is going. You probably already knew the story. They divide the bread and fish to discover it would be like the oil in the widow's story. It just keeps on keeping on. It is shared, and pretty soon the disciples discover that the people have had enough to eat. And not only that, they're left with a surplus of bread and fish, 12 baskets full of leftovers. How if the disciples had never taken Jesus seriously? I think that's the question that we need to ask of ourselves. How if we don't take Jesus seriously? Let's keep it with the disciples. How if they had received Jesus' command with all of the credulity that it actually deserved? What if they responded something like, you want us to feed them, Jesus? You've either got your head in the clouds or in the sand, and we can't tell which. And that would be a reasonable response to this idea that we might feed the multitudes with what little we've got. But instead, they decide to move on Jesus' command in faith, only to discover what today's story is meant to teach us. That you and I, we've got a lot more in-house than we realize. Most of us, perhaps. Me, definitely. And we'll never discover how much so long as we remain here in our apathy, despondency, or disbelief. So move. Do something. And when you do, you may well discover that you had more than you knew you had within you and in your community. What you needed to face the world with. You bring what you have to discover that you have more than you knew. The disciples moved, and just look at the result. And I'm not just talking in the story we read today. The result of the disciples moving and then moving again is the church. 12 disciples multiplied into millions. That's the same miracle of the loaves and the fish, except with people, and not literally. We forget that the entire church of Jesus, in fact, is built on this idea that when we actually get up and try to do the work, then what we had at first in meager supply is multiplied again and again as it's put to good use in the world. People join in the work. People then pool their resources to discover more within the community than they knew was there. The church then grows from within, from what we have in-house. So I'll pose to you the same question Elisha asked the widow. What do you have in-house? I mean your house. What do I have in my house? And what do I have in my community called Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, and all the other communities that I participate in? So, church, community, Let's not look into the future lamenting what we lack, what we wish we had. The people, the resources. We are haunted by the past here in America, and definitely at my church. So let's face it, we probably had more back then than we even knew what to do with. Now, by contrast, we feel so small. But we are not. We are enough. Our spiritual heritage contains one story after another where deserts give way to living water. One small boy with a slingshot and stones defeats the giant. One man goes into Egypt. I guess he brought his brother. And Moses brings an empire to its knees. It's a place where a widow needs a certain sum of money to keep her children out of enslavement. And they find jar after jar of oil. Sound familiar? Because this is our story, the story of the Jesus movement and his church. Our tradition tells of persons of faith who set out with nothing but a word of good news on their lips and the clothes on their backs, and we still tell their stories today. Or maybe what they had was 5 loaves and 2 fish, but then all ate and were filled. And that's all it took that day, and so we still tell the story to remind us what could be true for ourselves. Northwood Christian Church and every church besides, we have enough to go around, even if what we've got doesn't seem like much. I'll go down the street to buy 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish if that's what it takes to prove the point. And my point is, between the two of us, there is enough here to change the world and to rewrite history. The question becomes, will we take what we've got and get moving and feed a starving world? We'll find out together. In the meantime, bring what you've got to help your church, to help us feed this hungry world. After all, there is enough to go around. You'll find this out. But first, show up and bring what you have.